It's time for our panels, and I should explain in advance that I will call up the panelists by name. I won't give bios from the podium because in your programs everyone's bio is available. Our first panel, Clinical Development from Then to Now. 20 years is a very long era in the history of drug development. And for our first discussion panel today, we're fortunate to be joined by these CRO industry pioneers and ACRO founders, Mr. Joe von Rickenbach, Dr. Fred Eshelman, yes, are we here? Sir Dennis Gillings, along with FDA Commissioner Dr. Janet Woodcock. There is no better group. There is no better group of people to look at clinical development from then to now. So also please welcome our moderator for this panel, Dr. Cindy Verst, President, R&D Design and Delivery Innovation at IQVIA. Cindy?
You can read my name.
I will be here for a while. Well, firstly, we want to thank everyone for coming today and this astute panel that we have in front of us today. We are just so excited for each and every one of you to have joined us here today. And this is going to be a really comfortable conversation that we're going to have today. And so, please just feel free to riff, as my kids say, off of each other. And we are going to leave about 10-15 minutes at the end for some Q&As as well. So why don't we begin, just back in time. I'm going to take you back to the early 80s, where it all began. And maybe, you pioneers identifying a completely new market sector. Tell us about the circumstances as you each individually began to stand up your business models and maybe some of those barriers that you faced during that time, some 35 to 40 years ago. So maybe, Dennis, we'll start with you.
Well, yes, thank you, and hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. And I think, actually, with the panel, you'll find that we did come at these businesses from different points of view. I was a professor at the University of North Carolina in biostatistics and started out, and knew nothing actually about the pharma industry, but started out by being requested to consult on a very interesting project. There was a drug being introduced into the United States that supposedly had caused a lot of deaths in the then West Germany. And so they wanted some report. So I received 50 German hospital charts and wrote a report on it. That got me into then figuring out that actually it was the way the drug was processed in the body that was the problem. And then that led me on a path to consulting in the industry. The consulting in the industry identified, I would say, lots of inefficiencies, and probably at that time, the methodology of the industry, the methodological people weren't at the same level, perhaps, of some of my own peers. So that gave us an advantage of having a methodological springboard. And then that kept on, and then I began to understand the industry and saw an opportunity. So that was how my role started.
Terrific.
Never dreaming it would end up this large. Probably you, the same, Fred and Joe.
Absolutely.
So how about you, Joe?
Well, very different, as Dennis said. Good afternoon, by the way. Great to be here also. And as most of you know, I'm the founder of Parexel, just to kind of state the obvious. I'm probably the only non-scientist here. Okay, so and the way we came at it was that we started out providing regulatory services to companies overseas, who had trouble dealing with the FDA and kind of the US government regulations in general. And, the early 80s was a time of change in the pharmaceutical industry. You remember the Waxman-Hatch bill passed, that introduced competition in the industry, and a lot of people had questions about that, and this also created opportunities, of course. And on the heels of that, we did a lot of work for companies in Europe, in Japan, and they wanted to have their dossiers evaluated with respect to bringing their products into the US. And invariably, they would need ultimately one or several clinical trials. And we realized that there was nobody who provided these trials. You couldn't really, we said, well, we don't really do that. And eventually, we looked into this and whether we could provide the service, and we basically started on the heels of that a clinical trials business.
Terrific.
Well, my rationale was much simpler than these guys. I was in big pharma at the time running clinical research for a company, and had sort of cut my teeth in the era of H2 blockers. But in the course of that, I watched what we were paying to outside consultants and organizations, and I said, wait a minute. These guys are getting twice what I am, and they're working half the hours. This is just not right. So I'm going on the other side. So I went on the other side and decided, okay, what can we do here to help people through the change in NDA regulations in the middle 80s? So I started writing NDA sections and helping with trying to figure out, strategy with the FDA and stuff like that. And a few months into it, I got a call from a big pharma company, and they said, look, we want you to run an NDA program on XYZ, which happened to be an H2 blocker. I said, you don't understand. It's me and the dog. There's nobody else here at the time. And they said, no, you don't understand. Hire the people, get your equipment, get going. And this is the miracle of those days, which you probably remember. I said, well, wait a minute. I don't have any capital here. They said, don't worry about it. We'll give you a quarter of the contract up front. I went, even a boy from North Carolina got that one pretty quick. So, and then it went from there. So, rather be lucky than good.
So, Dr.
Remember, with this background, clinical research in those days was shooting from the hip. I mean, one researcher did it one way, another did it another way. You ended up by trying to get a result, but the whole process, it wasn't standardized and systematized and IT'd like it is today. So it was a very different background that we entered in those days.
But one thing that you shared with me recently, Dennis, your North Star from the beginning, to just give Dr. Woodcock some assurances that we weren't shooting from the hip all these years. Your holy grail, your North Star, was exactly what? And you mentioned that was the origin of Quintiles Transnational, about the data.
Well, it was my belief that because regulators looked at data, that you had to focus on the data. And because whatever you did, the regulators only had the data to look at. So that was always my focus and happened to match my background, yes.
Yeah. So Dr. Woodcock, you've had the bird's eye view of this industry. Maybe your thoughts over the last 35, 40 years of this sector.
Well, so much has changed, right? I mean, it's great this sector got started because it was really needed, but clinical research has changed so much, not in its absolute essential, where we want to find out evidence, but in how it's practiced, in the standardization, as you said, and also the sophistication of all the players, I think, has really changed dramatically. The understanding of biology. We've moved from empiricism to a great extent to very scientifically informed programs in most instances. And, you know, as everyone knows, I have very strong opinions about all this. I think a lot more change is needed, particularly in the clinical research enterprise. And the talk we just heard, you know, I think nails some of it. You know, we have to move toward a more patient-centric, disease-centric approach, in my opinion. And you guys have heard this from me before. So it's we need to focus on improving outcomes of disease. We talk about continuous improvement, and we often talk about that in business. But we got to think about it in medicine, that we continually improve the outcomes for patients over time. And so that's going to be one of my hobby horses going forward. There's been tremendous change, but there always is. That's the constant, I think, in this industry, because the underlying substrate of science and medicine is continually evolving, and clinical methodology. I mean, if you look back at these NDAs, that you probably we've come a long way. Let's just put it that way. I remember my horror, for example, when I first took over CEDAR, and that was in 1994, and I learned that we were just negotiating under ICH, okay, to make toxicology studies. You had to do kinetics to see if the animal actually was exposed. Before that, they didn't do that. And so they just gave it to the animal, and then they assumed that, you know, everything, it was absorbed, it was metabolized the same way, and so forth. So, I mean, there was a lot of things. In fact, Hatch-Waxman that you alluded to, you know, there was a huge brouhaha when that was passed over whether or not you should do bioequivalence studies. Oh yeah, and the AMA and others were like totally opposed to that. Because why would you know, you give the same strength to the person, well, that's it, right? You gave them the pill. Right? So unless you really go back and look at the history, you don't, because we've all lived the evolution. I don't think you realize how much things have changed.
No, you're spot on. In thinking about, you know, the industry sector is about 35, 40 years of age, but yet we sit here and we're celebrating our 20th year anniversary for ACRO. So maybe take us back in time. What was the impetus for the creation of ACRO, and maybe walking us through some of that history?
Well, I think Doug said it very well at the beginning. I suppose if we go back to 2000, our industry was really mushrooming a little bit. I mean, it had grown extensively in the 90s, but it didn't really have a reputation or a position in the whole life sciences industry. And so it was very, very important that we celebrated or tried to advocate a coming of age. And I think having an organization that represented the industry was very important at that stage. And it put us, I think, more firmly within the pharma life sciences sector, because we were very subservient actually to pharma and to regulators. I mean, we had to do what you told us to do and what the customer told us to do at that time.
And that was sometimes very unfortunate in both cases.
Yeah, there was really no choice, because that's what we were paid to do. But it's evolved since then, and the evolution now is there's a lot of thought leadership, I would say, in our industry.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of interaction that probably had its genesis in ACRO forming, because it enabled the industry to set its tone on the life sciences and the pharma industry as a whole.
Fred, Joe?
Well, this is of course absolutely true, but there was also a specific reason. Actually, we had a sort of a check-in on this topic in the 90s already, if you remember that. Dennis, you know, and we decided not to do it then. And in the early 2000s, we didn't just have friends, in the industry. We also had detractors, and they weren't. And we didn't have a voice as an industry, and that I think is what eventually channeled the genesis for ACRO. And the industry association, and gave us a voice, as Dennis pointed out.
Yeah, I think it also gave us a venue to come together and discuss dispassionately common problems, common opportunities, and so forth, putting aside the competition while we were doing that. And it was actually, reflecting on it now, I think, quite viable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how about Dr. Woodcock, your thoughts and views of ACRO, the entity, and how you or the FDA may view the association?
Well, I think it's really important that each player in the ecosystem have a voice and get together and share common problems and so forth, and solutions. You all have a unique viewpoint. You're not developing assets, right? You're offering services, intellectual and operational services. And so I think that ACRO can serve as a, sort of midwife to some of the changes that are going to have to go on, and provide that sector a voice. So I think it's important.
So maybe we'll, again, kind of go back in time, and with each of your entities or the CRO industry at large, can you hearken back and identify a very tumultuous time, or a time of adversity within your respective companies or the industry, and how you overcame those, and if any of those insights might be still applicable as we sit here today in 2022?
Well, I can give one thing that probably relates a little to the opening speech. In the time of AIDS, when it was emerging, we played quite a role in AZT, and one of the issues was mothers or pregnant women who had AIDS, would their newborn also have AIDS? And I remember at that time, we estimated there were 2,500 women who were pregnant who would give birth over the next year did have AIDS, and that was the target audience, and we had to find about 600 of them, and we managed to do that. And AZT was approved, and it was also approved for pregnant women, and it did save a number of infants. So that was traumatic in the sense that it was a big health event in the United States. The regulatory agencies treatment INDs came in, and so there was a lot of juggling around to accommodate something being put on the market along the lines which the initial speaker was saying too. So that's maybe an analogy with my direct experience.
Well, fine, I'll go. So in our history, we had, of course, a number of upsets, but I'd say the biggest one probably was what I refer to teaching error. So in 2006, a phase 1 study in London went awry. And what happened basically was one of the first immuno-oncology drugs, an agonist, was tested by us in our phase 1 unit in London. And the volunteers had basically a cytokine reaction and nearly died. And this was a huge upset for us as a company, but also for the industry and probably for the regulators, if you remember that, because nobody did anything wrong. And the assumption always was, if everybody does everything right, this should not happen. This cannot happen. And of course, by the way, it was not easy to find out that nobody did anything wrong, because the assumption immediately was, you did everything wrong. for sure, this must be, first our fault, then the manufacturer's fault, and everybody else in the middle. And it turns out nobody did anything wrong, really. And, it also just pointed out that, the safety comes first. Luckily, in our case, we had all our phase 1 units, of which we had 6 at the time, were within 2 minutes of an emergency room. And so we were able to put these kids, they were all basically 20-year-old young men, into an emergency room, and all their lives were saved. I'm happy to say, I'm thankful for that to this day. But also an important lesson was learned. And the lesson basically is, if you do something often enough, even if it's highly improbable, eventually the worst outcome will happen. And you have to be prepared for that, and you have to be able to survive it. And I would say, from the regulators to every single boardroom in the pharmaceutical industry, important lessons were learned, from that incident. And also, we as an industry and ACRO learned a lot on how to deal with this kind of an emergency, because we didn't really have, thankfully, a precedent until then.
Thank you, Joe. Fred?
Yeah, when I think back to these days, I guess I think about it a little more on the operational side, because what we actually did was industrialize clinical development. We really did.
Yes.
If you take it from ground zero. And we were doing this, to your point, with bosses all over the place. Let's say you had 100 clients. You got 100 bosses. You might have 100 SOPs.
Right.
We got the FDA in between. Sometimes we were asked to do stuff that was skating right on the edge, and not so much. And when we were trying to do that and do it more efficiently and hire the very best people that we could, because in the early days, the attitude, particularly in big pharma, was, well, if you work on the CRO side, you must have been lobotomized because you can't have any cogent thoughts. Just do what we tell you to do. And so we had to work our way through that. And then when the industry really took off and the growth was just unimaginable, and we're, again, trying to get the very best people, Joe would have a good quarter, Dennis has a good quarter, whatever. All of a sudden, they're hiring like mad, or we're hiring like mad, or whatever. And so the turnover rate within the CRAs, who were the people who were actually doing the field work, would just get totally out of hand. And it was extremely difficult to manage through those things. So I think in retrospect, kudos to the, at that time, very young people that brought this industry up and running, because it wasn't easy.
We really had to persuade them to join us, didn't we, in those days?
Yeah.
It was act of persuasion, yes.
And how about Dr. Woodcock, your thoughts?
Well, of course, the FDA's never had any controversies.
Of course not.
However, all right, I mean, from my personal point of view, I mean, I've always been I feel like I'm going uphill against the culture of, the first efforts were standardization, the GCPs, which we did before ACRO was formed, trying to standardize basic processes and definitions. Subsequent to that, I remember I gave a talk to Citi, and I don't remember when that was, but it was maybe 15 years ago, about translating some of the concepts we had about quality by design, things like statistical process monitoring rather than physical monitoring, and quality by design, using IT and designing things, testing them before you did them to make sure they worked and so forth. Of course, that would then be opposed to the GCPs, and we're still in that stage today. And I would challenge you all and everybody in the room to try and go more for risk-based monitoring, remote monitoring, and some of the concepts. But I recognize both internal to the FDA and external, as far as established custom. You know, this is how we do things, right? And during COVID, that became quite a problem. All right. And then, of course, probably, and I forget which PDUFA it was that I said we will do patient-focused drug development as one of the programs that we will propose, okay? And it includes, you know, many of the activities that were talked about earlier, such as, you know, consulting the patients, empowering the patients, getting them involved. I've been on the board of PCORI, and they actually have really pioneered, I think, patient involvement, at least in clinical research, from soup to nuts, from design of the protocol, even conceptualization of the research program, all the way through to evaluating the results and everything in between. So for me, leaving aside all the individual controversies that we've dealt with over the years, it's this trajectory of trying to get the clinical research ecosystem to really serve the needs of the society in the best way possible. And I think, you know, and I've certainly told NIH this, so I'm not talking out of school, I believe that the pharmaceutical industry and the medical product industry, as well as the NIH industry, all right, they aren't quite on target, okay, for the needs of the patients. And so, again, that's a very uphill effort to try and make those things better align. I understand, for example, the medical products folk, they have to make a profit, okay? They have to stay in business, as do you all, right? However, I think we could still align our objectives better. So, you know, these are consistent threads of kind of controversy or lack of alignment or whatever that's been going on for a long time. We're still battling the GCP versus, you know, how to best assure quality. It's still, we're still not there yet, yeah.
Well, you mentioned risk-based monitoring. I think that's interesting because I feel one of the architects, certainly in my own company, of that. However, I mean, remember the difficulty. The industry was reluctant to switch because the FDA wouldn't guarantee that the switch was okay.
I know.
So you had, and we were caught in the middle.
Right. I'm not blaming you. Like I said, this is cultural inside the
Yes.
FDA, inside the regulators around the world. We made GCPs. We love them, okay, but they're a creature of the late 1980s, early 1990s, right? It's quality control mentality. And yet, you know, we're so happy with what we have because it was so much better than what we had before that we're unwilling to get up to the next level, I think. So I agree. I mean,
It's very different, though, when you're on the receiving end of FDA auditors. I mean, I don't know how many times we would receive FDA auditors probably twice a week,
right.
indefinitely. And they didn't always say, for example, what Richard Temple said.
They're not singing from the same, all singing
That's
from
right,
the same.
That's right. And then our customers weren't singing from the same tune either.
I know. Well, that's what I mean. It's a cultural issue that we have to surmount. It's not, you know, somebody's fault. It's, yeah. Everybody's laughing though.
Maybe this is my job now to step in as moderator.
Well, it's interesting to see some of the issues. I mean, when you've got big players in an industry.
Well, and I think that's really the opportunity that ACRO and the aggregated CRO and technology industry. As you know, Dr. Woodcock, as we came and surfaced our collective data sets on RBQM to say, you know, we are absolutely recommending RBQM.
Right.
And the adoption is a bit lower, but you know, here's some efforts and you know the guidance documents that you've released and really helping to promulgate that. I think it is going to take the proverbial village.
Well, we've gone through, I'm sorry.
No, go right ahead.
We've gone through the exact same thing with manufacturing, which I started earlier, okay? And like why, you know, we make 1 million vials and we test 30, right? And you can test each one online, right? And do it automatically. And yet, it's like, no, because you have to take it to the wet lab and you have to test it, right? Because that's what we've always done. And so, continuous manufacturing, though, finally, with COVID, is taking off, which have all these concepts very similar to what we're talking about here. You're talking about manufacturing was just like, clinical work went from an academic doing stuff, right? As a physician, researcher, the MAP model, right? Going to what you said, industrialization. But now we ought to go to automation, right? Get this up to another level, right? But it is really hard, and most of it is us, not FDA, but us. Yeah. And that's why I agree ACRO is so important, because it can really be a force for change.
That's terrific. Well, I know we are coming to our Q&A session here, but I want to give you each an opportunity for, anything that we missed here that is an important part of the journey over the last 35, 40 years that, maybe the maturation of the industry that is so true today and beyond. That's going to take us to the next level here.
Well, I was just going to say, on the heels of what we just talked about and what has been also mentioned before by Dennis, when in the 80s, this was really an artisanal activity. Everything was basically a piece of art. And I think what our industry has accomplished, or one of the big accomplishments, one of a number, is that we have been able to bring clinical research into the open. I don't know how often they were audited before, but in my last year at Par Excel, we were audited more than 1,500 times in 1 year, somewhere in the world. Okay, the level of scrutiny that we had and have on us is unbelievable. So it's transparent, and the invisible hand of competition also put the locus of innovation in this field into the CRO industry and into the CRO world. And I think, the market has done its job over the last 35, 40 years. And, compared to then, what we have today is incomparable. And I think we really, as companies, should really be proud of that. I mean, we all did that.
I think, Joe, I wanted to pause. Dr. Woodcock, I don't know if you'll recall, but you addressed ACRO a number of months ago at one of our last board meetings, and it was, post-COVID, we were reflecting on, those best practices and how do we keep those sustainable. Right. And, she gave the entire CRO technology industry accolades and saying that had we not been standing on your shoulders with the industrialization and moving into automation, and getting into the community, to your prior comment, reaching the patients and diverse patients and inclusivity at that. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe you can just share your point of view of this industry, the sector, and our ability to get to those community patients and enroll the tens of thousands of patients in unprecedented timelines.
Yeah, that was incredible. And, a lot of it, like you said, you've brought both transparency and the sort of industrialization. If we were still in the artisanal, we do each one by hand type of thing, we never would have been able to mount the response we had to COVID. I remember major pharmaceutical companies, not more than 15 years ago, still, they did each little development group did their own protocol, so they didn't have anything standardized. They couldn't put their data together because they collected it, even in the same development program, they collected it differently. And so they had to spend months reconciling their data sets. You're very familiar with this. So but I do think that the issues with COVID revealed real problems with the clinical research ecosystem, not your side of it, but you recognize there were thousands of clinical trials done that were not powered to yield any information. and didn't yield any actionable information. Maybe they yielded papers. They were mainly done at, major medical centers. We had trials that were competing. There were 20 other little trials enrolling in that. Most of them had, their single PI type of. So I believe that partly where we need to go is to reach out more in the community. They say by 2025 that 70% of US doctors will belong to an integrated healthcare system. Well, why should they only be enrolling patients at the medical center? Right? I believe that access to clinical research is a right, just like healthcare. It's a part of excellent healthcare to be able to access. For example, cancer patients in the United States, only 1 in 10 or something are offered to participate in a clinical trial, even though 50% of them or more say they would like to be in a clinical trial. So we've still got a long way to go to that outreach in the community, and I'm pushing this on the government side. I'm trying to push on this. But you all have the reach capacity, although it's more work, right, to sustain those community investigators. They need more support. They need more training and so forth.
Right, thank you. Fred, Dennis, any last thoughts, comments?
Well, I guess I would just say that, contrary to my previous comment about people on the CRO side having a lobotomy, I think all of that has, in most cases, changed. But there's been so much flux in both directions in terms of who works where.
Yeah.
So people from the CRO industry have gone back to industry. People in industry, of course, have come over here with their experience and so forth and so on. And I think it was to the benefit of both, because I think there was a heck of a lot of learning from a lot of different sources that finally began to take root. So I think that was a big deal, actually.
Yeah, I think there's been 2 major contributions of the CRO industry. One is recruiting patients more quickly, and we've sort of heard that. And the other, I think, is the automation of data from pencil and paper, and now it's relatively automated, which you referred to as industrialization. They're the 2 huge contributions, I think.
Indeed, indeed. Okay, well, we've got about 10 minutes, and if there are any questions out there, please feel free to step up to a mic, and we are here to address your questions.
I'll go first. It's really just a carry on of some of the discussion, and I was going to ask the question this way, maybe take the liberty of asking the panel the question, but asking Dr. Woodcock to answer first, and let the others respond to her comments. And it's really this issue of what I call the COVID catalyst. Right? It's been an incredible 2 years for pharma, for the CRO industry, for regulatory agencies in terms of what we've been able to do in developing drugs, saving lives, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure there are a lot of people in this room who worried that we're not going to sustain that. So the question is, what can we do to make sure that that nimbleness, that inventiveness, that flexibility, that resources that were available, what can we do to maintain that rather than lose that momentum?
Well, I think many people were shocked and just how much we can actually get done without, say, being in the office, without the patient coming into the office, without whatever. And that shows how much culture actually kind of shrouds our thoughts and our inventiveness, because in fact the FDA, we went almost fully remote for all the review activities, and we got more productivity out of the people than if they'd been at the office. And so I'm promulgating a pilot to see, what our new way of work actually should be, because we ought to situate people so they can be most productive, although there's some benefit to social interaction, and there are trade-offs there. With respect to clinical research, I think, we put out guidance. There was a long list of discretion we were going to have and changes. And the programs are in the process now of figuring out how much of that can be carried forward. Because, again, in clinical research, just like in working at the office, we had a lot of preconceptions about how it had to be done, and those were shattered by necessity. And so now we have a broader understanding of what we can accomplish and how. So we need to take forward everything that's beneficial. There's some things that may still be done better or differently, and we have to figure that out.
As regards sustaining, I think we're in a very fortunate time, because the whole basis of medicine is moving to molecular medicine and genetics, proteomics, and so forth, which is engendering a huge surge in inventiveness. And then we also now have the pandemics that have received the public attention, so we've got to be forever on our guard against things that may happen on the infectious diseases front. And then we have diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia looming that are really going to hit in 5 to 10 years' time. So I think the sustaining is almost a natural consequence of the times we're in, to be honest with you. And there seems to be a great interest in terms of the markets, investment, and so forth, and the government, to make sure all these things are sustained. So and even NIH funding is also at the moment increasing. So I think all these things are hugely positive for sustaining where we're already going.
Fred, Joe, any?
Well, I would just say, the pandemic, was a catalyst for technology adoption. If you kind of step back and say, for those of us who have brought technology to the sector for decades, the adoption of new technology was always very slow.
Yeah.
For all variety of reasons, partly regulatory, but mainly culturally. And during the pandemic, this really accelerated. And and I think not surprisingly, we have a number of technology companies here now, which is great. But we are still only scratching the surface there. And I would say, looking forward, while I agree with Dennis that we have made a big impact in terms of enrolling patients, it is still a very kind of uncertain aspect of the whole activity. Most sites don't really perform well, and most clinical trials are still delayed, and mainly because of patient accrual. And I think that a number of these technologies and new approaches can help us to bring the same rigor to that side of the business as we now have on this side of the business. This side of the business being defined as from the point forward where the data is captured to FDA submission, basically. And so, I'm excited about that prospect.
Thank you, Joe. Fred, any final comments?
No, I think my colleagues have covered it pretty well.
Okay. Other questions? We've got a few more minutes here.
One quick comment. I want to thank you guys for giving me an opportunity to have a career out of college, and I had no idea what clinical research was. So I'm that CRA that you recruited. But I've had a lot of great growth from ACRO in the last 5 years. As you guys start to transition, don't take this the wrong way, the torch to the next generation, what does the next 20 years look like for us leaders in ACRO? How can we help continue that growth that you guys started? Do you have any words of wisdom for us?
I would like to see integration, to your point, okay? So we have over here, we have the electronic health records somewhere over there, right? And then we have the case report forms somewhere over here, right? And they're collecting a lot of the same information, and they identify those health records over there, identify people who have conditions. Sometimes they do. You know, they're not very good, right? But that's what we've got. During COVID, the UK really outperformed the United States in recruiting and patients and doing a master protocols and actually getting actionable results that impacted millions of lives probably around the world because they did large, simple master protocols, right? Run off of their local, you know, healthcare systems that they had. I would see that the future, to the question, the future really is going to involve integration of recruitment and the trial itself and so forth into the health record, and also master protocols that go on, that continue over a long time in different disease areas, and not necessarily you know, some very small rare disease, but say common diseases that many Americans have. It would be very interesting to have a master protocol that followed and looked at interventions and so forth. So I believe that's part of the future, is if we're gonna have to do like population-based interventions practically. So we're going to have to study those. And you know, what you all have been doing is the sort of the pharmaceutical industry in particular does kind of the one-off improvements, right? Let's test this asset, let's test that asset. But what about population health overall? And I see that as a really open area for clinical research in the future, if we're going to improve the health of our population.
Well, carrying on from that, I mean, I think there's a movement already underway where instead of a clinical trial or a study going on solely in a doctor's office, it's moving to the patient. Mm-hmm. So we're going to see that movement, I'm sure, continue. And of course, that will imply automation of certain measurements, either through a special wristwatch or an iPad or a variety of automated procedures. So that process of automation will continue to make clinical trials more accessible. I think the large data or big data, which is sort of one of the things that I have always dreamed of, that is going to have a big impact in epidemiology, because as Janet has just said, that will enable huge numbers of things to be associated with various people and various diseases, various types of drugs people take, so that we'll have a lot better understanding of our epidemiological health. So I would say those two trends will carry on dramatically over the next 10 years.
So could I ask Dr. Woodcock a question?
Ask the moderator. Sure.
You know, we're talking about all these things, and they're absolutely true and so forth, but, and I see a lot of this in what I'm doing now. Oncology, particularly in the areas of unmet medical need, doesn't fit a bunch of the stuff that we're talking about. And it just seems to me that sometimes the ball gets dropped somehow between us, industry, and you guys on what's important at a particular stage of development in oncology. Do you have any reflection on that?
You know, oncology is, because their cancer centers like studded like raisins all over the country, you know, we could, and unfortunately we haven't, but we could really gather those up into more of a network. There have been some efforts to try and do that, like the lung map trial, like what OSPI is doing and so forth. Because to the earlier point, oncology is becoming targeted. So you might have 1,000 lung cancer patients, you might only have 50 with that particular molecular signature. You got to screen them all. And so a better idea really would be intake them all and then spread them out to various subgroups and tests based on their phenotype. So I don't know though exactly what you mean, because we've been very successful in moving cancer drugs to the clinic, although of course there's a great deal of controversy about that.
Right.
Is that what you mean?
Sort of.
Yeah. Well, that's, again, we just had something at the Reagan-Udall Institute the other day about accelerated approval and the controversies, and we had a patient panel. We had a woman, for example, who had breast cancer diagnosed at age 35, and after she went through the whole chemotherapy, then the whole, aromatase inhibitors, she found she had metastatic disease. So she was like 38 years old or something like that, and she had a 3-year prognosis. And she got onto a targeted therapy that was approved by accelerated approval, and she's still alive today. So there's a trade-off between that and getting more certainty, and how quickly and how certain you want to be before you basically pay, because I think this is mainly about cost. So oncology, the Cancer Center of Excellence is really trying to clean up its what they call dangling accelerated approvals and force the issue, finish the trial or take the drug off the market or so forth. But the vast majority of them have converted to full approvals over time.
Well, I want to, unfortunately, we're out of time, but on behalf of the entire sector, thank you. Thank you for your significant contributions, and Janet, thank you for your continued championship of our industry, and we appreciate all of the work you've been doing as your acting chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.